The cold was a physical thing, a thief that stole the breath from her lungs and the feeling from her fingers. Naomi sat ramrod straight on the frozen metal of the bus station bench, a small, defiant island in the biting December wind. The thin, gray wool of her coat was a pathetic defense against the Chicago winter, especially on Christmas Eve. Underneath it, the light blue fabric of her hospital scrubs felt like ice against her skin. 18 years old, a brand new nursing certification in her wallet, and an eviction notice that had rendered both meaningless. Her landlord hadn't cared that it was the holidays. The rent was late and she was out. She had just finished a 16-hour shift, the kind that left your feet screaming and your soul hollowed out. But the exhaustion was a distant hum beneath the immediate, sharp reality of the cold. The bus was late, or maybe it wasn't coming at all. A tear froze on her cheek, a tiny, stinging crystal. She swiped at it with a numb glove, anger warring with despair. She refused to cry. Not here. Not like this. A car slid to the curb, so silent it seemed to have materialized from the shadows. It was long and black, a shade that drank the weak city light and gave nothing back. The rear window descended with a whisper, revealing a man in the back seat. She didn't look at his face. She looked at the sliver of his suit visible in the gloom. It was dark, impeccably tailored, the fabric catching the streetlight in a way that spoke of obscene expense. Her eyes traveled up to the hand resting on the open window frame. Long fingers, unadorned except for a watch with a dark face that glinted, not sparkled. He was looking at her. She could feel the weight of his gaze, deliberate and assessing. It wasn't the kind of look she usually got from men in expensive cars. Not leering, not predatory, but something cooler, more analytical. Like he was solving a problem. She turned her head, staring resolutely at the empty street where the bus was supposed to be. Ignore him. He'll go away. Men like that, in cars like that, were a different species. Their world had no intersection with hers. The car door opened. The sound was a soft, expensive thud. Footsteps on the salted pavement, crisp and measured. He stopped a few feet from her bench. The scent of him reached her first, carried on a swirl of frigid air, cedar and something else, something like cold smoke. "The number 7 bus isn't running," a low voice said. It was smooth, with a distinct lack of inflection, an accent she couldn't quite place, but that rounded the edges of his English. "An accident on the bridge." Naomi didn't respond. She kept her eyes forward, her jaw tight. Acknowledging him felt like a concession she couldn't afford to make. "It will be 10 degrees below zero within the hour." The voice continued, patient, relentless. "You will not survive it out here." This time she turned. She couldn't help it. His certainty was galling. And that's when she made the mistake of looking up. His face was all sharp angles and pale, flawless skin, a stark contrast to the city's grime. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything and been impressed by nothing. He was Korean, she guessed, his features sculpted with a precision that was both beautiful and intimidating. He wore his power like he wore his suit, a perfect custom fit. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice rough. A flicker of something, not amusement, something else, passed through his eyes. "No, you won't. You are already past the point of shivering. That is the final stage before hypothermia becomes irreversible." He knew that. Of course he knew that. He spoke it like a fact from a textbook. She was a nurse. She knew it too. The knowledge was a cold stone in her gut, heavier than the fear. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp. "To offer you a ride," he said simply. "I don't get in cars with strangers." "A wise policy," he conceded. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. She flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement. He paused, his hand still. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was being deliberate, showing her he meant no harm. He withdrew a small black card. He didn't offer it to her. He placed it on the bench between them. "My name is Jean Huan. This is the address of a hotel a few blocks from here. I have a room there. You can take it for the night. Or you can call the number on that card, and my driver will take you anywhere else you need to go." She stared at the card. It was thick, matte black, with a string of numbers in simple, silver print. No name, no company, just a number. Why? The word escaped before she could stop it. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for a second, the mask slipped. She saw a flicker of something ancient and weary in his eyes. Because my sister was stubborn too, and no one was there to offer her a ride. He straightened up, turned, and walked back to the car. The door closed with that same soft, final thud. The window slid up. The car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the night as silently as it had arrived. She was alone again. The wind howled, a hungry animal. The cold was sinking into her bones now, a deep, aching numbness. She looked at the black card. A hotel room, a warm bed. It was a lifeline. It was also a thread, connecting her to a man who smelled of power and smoke, a man whose eyes held unnerving knowledge. She looked down the empty street. The bus was not coming. Her apartment was no longer hers. Her choices had narrowed to one. With a hand that was shaking from more than just the cold, she reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling with the frozen screen. She had no other option. She dialed the number on the card. The phone was answered on the first ring.
No greeting.
Just silence, waiting. Hello. Naomi's voice was a croak. Where are you? It was him, Jean Juan. His voice was unchanged, calm, as if he'd been waiting for her call. The bus station, she whispered. Stay there. A car is coming. The line went dead. Less than a minute later, the same black sedan slid back to the curb. The back door opened, pushed from the inside. This time, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her worn duffel bag, the black card, and slid into the overwhelming warmth of the car. The door closed, sealing her in. The world outside went silent. The car smelled of rich leather and that same scent of cedar and cold smoke. It smelled of him. She was in his world now. He wasn't in the car. A driver with a grim face sat behind a pane of glass, his eyes on the road. They drove in silence, through streets that glittered with holiday lights that seemed to mock her. They didn't go to a hotel. They bypassed the glittering downtown lobbies and drove toward the river, to a sleek, modern tower of glass and steel that scraped the sky. The car descended into a private garage, through 3 security gates, each manned by guards in dark suits who nodded at the driver without a word. Her heart began to beat a frantic, trapped rhythm against her ribs. This wasn't a hotel. This was a fortress. The driver led her to a private elevator. He used a key card, then pressed the button for the penthouse. The doors opened directly into a sprawling living space. The entire west wall was a sheet of glass, revealing the city lights spread out like a carpet of fallen stars. The apartment was magnificent and sterile. White walls, black leather furniture, gleaming chrome and glass. There were no photos, no clutter, no sign that a human being actually lived here, save for a single, heavy glass of amber liquid sitting on a low table. Jean Juan was standing by the window, his back to her. He hadn't changed his suit. He looked out at the city like he owned it. Maybe he did. You're not at a hotel, she stated, her voice surprisingly steady. Her training kicked in, assessed the situation, identify the threats. No, he said without turning. This is safer. Safer for who? He finally turned. His dark eyes swept over her, taking in the cheap coat, the worn scrubs, the defiant set of her jaw. For you, he gestured to a hallway. There is a guest room, a shower. Food is in the refrigerator. Make yourself comfortable. It was a dismissal, just like that. He had brought her here, to this gilded cage, and now he was done with her. A woman, older and severe-looking in a simple black dress, appeared as if from nowhere. She bowed her head slightly toward Jean Juan. See that she is everything she needs, he commanded, his voice soft but absolute. The woman nodded and turned to Naomi. This way, miss. Naomi followed, feeling like a stray dog being led to a kennel. The guest room was larger than her entire old apartment. A king-sized bed with a mountain of white pillows, an attached bathroom bigger than her bedroom. On the bed were folded clothes, a soft black sweatsuit, thick socks, a t-shirt. They looked expensive. After the woman left, Naomi stood in the middle of the room, her duffel bag a shabby stain on the pristine white carpet. This was a test of some kind, or a transaction. She didn't know the rules. She stripped off her frozen clothes, leaving them in a sad pile, and stepped into the shower. The hot water was a shock, a blessing. It sluiced the cold from her bones and the grime of the city from her skin. When she emerged, wrapped in a towel thick enough to be a blanket, she saw him. He was standing in the doorway of her room, holding her discarded scrubs. He held them delicately, between his thumb and forefinger, as if they were a contaminated object. "You're a nurse," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she answered, clutching the towel tighter. He looked from the scrubs to her, his gaze lingering on the line of her collarbone. "My sister wanted to be a doctor." There it was again. The sister. The ghost in his machine. He dropped the scrubs onto a chair as if they had burned him. "The woman who attacked my driver on the bridge tonight, her associates are looking for witnesses." The blood drained from Naomi's face. "I didn't see anything." "They don't know that," he said, his voice flat. "They just know a car stopped for a woman at a bus station near the scene. They are thorough. You are now a loose end, which is why you are here, and why you will stay here until I have dealt with them." The floor dropped out from under her. This wasn't charity. This wasn't a moment of human kindness. This was a cage built for his convenience. She was a problem he had to manage. The anger returned, hot and sharp. "You can't keep me here," she said, her voice low. His eyes narrowed. "Can't I?" He took a step into the room, and the space seemed to shrink. "Out there is a city that will let you freeze to death on a bench. There are men who will kill you for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. In here," he paused, his gaze intense, "there is only me. You will have to decide which is more dangerous." He left, pulling the door closed behind him. The silence he left behind was heavier than any sound. She was trapped. But as she stood there, dripping on the expensive rug, a new, cold resolve settled over her. He thought she was a loose end, a piece on his board. He didn't know her. He didn't know the steel that had been forged in a life of having nothing and no one. She would survive this, and she would survive him. She spent the next day in a state of suspended animation. She ate the food the silent housekeeper left for her. She explored the vast, empty apartment. She found the source of his wound. In his office, a stark room with a desk the size of a car, a single silver frame was turned face down. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. She turned it over. It was a girl, younger than him, but with the same sharp features and intelligent, dark eyes. She was smiling, a brilliant, full-hearted smile, wearing a university sweatshirt. She looked vibrant, full of life. This was the sister, the one who was stubborn, the one he failed to protect. Naomi put the photo back down, exactly as she had found it, a cold knot of understanding tightening in her chest. This wasn't just about a loose end. This was a ghost he was trying to appease. Later that night, the sterile peace of the penthouse was shattered. The front door opened and Jean Huan entered, flanked by two men. He was leaning on one of them, and the sleeve of his perfect gray suit was dark with blood. His men tried to steer him toward a chair, but he waved them off. "Leave," he commanded, his voice tight with pain. They hesitated, looking from him to Naomi, who stood frozen in the hallway. "Now," he bit out. They vanished as silently as they had appeared. He sank onto one of the black leather sofas, his head falling back, his face pale under the track lighting. A deep gash ran along his forearm, bleeding sluggishly through the torn fabric of his shirt and suit jacket. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain and fury. "Go to your room." Naomi didn't move. The nurse in her took over, pushing past the fear, past the shock. She saw a patient, a wound that needed tending. "That needs stitches," she said, her voice calm and professional. "And a pressure dressing before you go into shock." "I have a doctor," he growled. "He's not here." "I am." She walked to him, her bare feet silent on the polished concrete floor. She knelt before him, her earlier fear replaced by a sharp, focused confidence. "Take off the jacket." He stared at her, a strange expression on his face. It was the first time anyone had given him an order in this apartment. It was probably the first time in years. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then, with a pained grunt, he allowed her to help him shrug off the ruined jacket. She ripped the sleeve of his expensive cotton shirt to get a better look. The cut was deep, clean, probably from a knife. It was bleeding steadily. I need a first aid kit. And towels. He nodded toward a cabinet. In there. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady. She found the kit, more of a trauma bag, really stocked with everything she could possibly need. She packed the wound, applied pressure, her touch firm and impersonal. He hissed in pain but didn't pull away. He just watched her. He watched the concentration on her face, the efficient way her fingers moved, the complete absence of fear in her eyes. Their proximity was absolute. Her hair brushed his knee. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, feel the tension in his muscles under her hands. The smell of cedar and smoke was now mingled with the metallic tang of his blood. The silence stretched, filled only by his ragged breathing and the soft sounds of her work. When she was done, she had his arm bandaged tightly, the bleeding stopped. She sat back on her heels, her task complete. "It will hold until your doctor gets here," she said, her professional calm starting to fray at the edges. "You were lucky. It missed the artery." He looked down at his bandaged arm, then back at her. His dark eyes were clear now, the pain receding, replaced by that same unnerving intensity. "You are not afraid of blood." "I'm a nurse," she said simply. "It's part of the job. This," he gestured around the room, at the invisible violence that clung to the very air, "is not part of your job." "No," she agreed, her voice quiet. "It's not." He reached out with his uninjured hand, not to touch her, but to gently move a stray strand of hair from her face. His fingers barely brushed her skin, but a jolt went through her, sharp and unexpected. It was a moment of impossible tenderness from a man made of steel and shadows. "Thank you," he said. The two words sounded foreign on his tongue, like a language he rarely spoke. That was the moment everything changed. She had touched his weakness, and he had not destroyed her for it. She had seen the man beneath the monster, a man who bled like anyone else. And in his eyes, she saw something new. Not ownership, not possession. Recognition. The next day, she made a choice. She could have stayed in her room, a compliant prisoner. Instead, she walked into his office while he was on a call, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. She didn't wait for him to finish. She picked up a medical textbook from his shelf, a strange, out-of-place item, and started reading. It was a deliberate act, a claim of space. She was no longer just a guest. She was a presence. When he hung up, the silence was heavy. "You are testing my patience." "You said I had to stay here," she replied, not looking up from the book. "You didn't say I had to be invisible." A slow smile touched his lips, a rare, startling thing. "No," he said. "I did not." The danger, however, had not forgotten her. A few days later, Jean Huan allowed her a supervised trip. She needed her last paycheck from the hospital, the final tie to her old life. One of his men, a silent giant named Min, drove her. As she was walking back to the car, an unmarked van screeched to a halt beside her. Two men jumped out. Panic seized her. But before they could grab her, Min was there, a blur of motion. It was over in seconds. Not a fight. A brutal, efficient dismantling. One of the men on the ground had a tattoo on his wrist, a rival family's mark. The Kims. Back in the penthouse, Jean Huan was furious. Not at her, but at the breach. "They know who you are," he said, his voice a low growl. "They think you are my weakness." "Am I?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. He stepped closer, his dark eyes boring into hers. "Weakness is a luxury I have never been afforded. But you," he trailed off, his jaw tight. "You are a complication I am finding myself unwilling to resolve." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. Not a declaration of love, but something more dangerous. An admission of a crack in his armor. An admission that she mattered. That night, she couldn't sleep. She found him in his office, staring at a screen filled with surveillance photos. One of them was of the man Min had disabled. He was being held somewhere, questioned. Jean Huan's face was a mask of cold fury. He was deciding the man's fate. Naomi thought of the endless cycle, the violence, the blood she had cleaned from his arm. She walked over and stood behind him. "The other one," she said, her voice low. "The one who drove the van. I saw him at the hospital last week. He was asking about shift changes in the ER. He wasn't asking for himself. Jean Huan went still. He turned his head slowly to look at her. She had just given him tactical information. She had crossed a line. She was no longer just a witness. She was a participant. She was helping him hunt. He closed the file on the screen. He stood up, turning to face her. The space between them crackled with unspoken tension. "You should have run the first chance you got," he whispered, his voice rough. "I know," she whispered back. "Why didn't you?" "I told myself it was survival," she admitted, the truth raw and terrifying. "But I was lying to myself." He closed the distance between them in a single step. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Naomi," he said, and the way he said her name was different. It was not a label. It was a claim. "They will not stop. They will come for you to get to me." "Let them come," she said, surprising herself with the steel in her own voice. His thumb stroked her cheekbone, his eyes searching hers for any sign of doubt. Finding none, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a soft kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and possession, a confirmation of everything they had not said. It was the sealing of a pact made in blood and shadows. She kissed him back, meeting his fire with her own, a conscious choice to step out of the cold and into the inferno. The final confrontation came a week later. The Kims, frustrated and cornered, made a desperate move. They didn't target the penthouse fortress. They targeted the hospital. They knew she was a nurse. They knew her old life. They took the emergency room hostage, demanding Jean Huan in exchange for the lives of his woman and her former colleagues. But Naomi wasn't there. She was with Jean Huan, in the penthouse, when the news broke. He went rigid, his empire's resources instantly mobilizing. But Naomi saw a different angle. "They think I'm there," she said, her mind racing. "They think they have you trapped." She grabbed a blueprint of the hospital she had studied from one of his files. "But they're in my house, my emergency room." She wasn't a soldier. She couldn't fire a gun. But she was a nurse. She knew that building better than anyone. She knew the supply closets, the staff tunnels, the weaknesses in the surveillance system. She was not a victim to be rescued. She was an asset. "I can get people out," she told him, her finger tracing a route on the blueprint. "The pediatric ward connects to the old laundry chute. They won't be guarding it." He looked at her, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He saw not a liability, but a queen on his chessboard. "Min will go with you. You will not be exposed." "I won't," she promised. "But I'm not hiding." The climax was not a firefight in the lobby. It was a surgical operation, directed by a king and executed by a queen. While Jean Huan's forces created a perimeter, Naomi, with Min as her shadow, used her staff credentials to move through the lockdown sections of the hospital. She directed nurses to move patients, guided doctors through back corridors, relayed the captors' positions and numbers to Jean Huan via a secure earpiece. She was calm, efficient, and lethal in her own way. She saved 12 people, including 2 children, before the first shot was even fired. When Jean Huan's team finally breached the ER, it was to a scene of controlled chaos orchestrated by her. The enemy was disoriented, their plan in tatters. The fight was short and brutal. Jean Huan found her not cowering in a closet, but in a triage bay, applying a tourniquet to a wounded security guard's leg, her face set in a mask of intense concentration. He walked through the carnage, his eyes only on her. He stopped before her, his shoes inches from a pool of blood. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand. She looked from the wounded guard, who was now being tended by a paramedic, to Jean Huan's outstretched hand. She placed her own hand in his. His grip was warm and firm. He pulled her to her feet. In the aftermath, a cost was paid. Her old life was officially over. The hospital, the city, the media, they now knew her as the woman at the center of a mafia war. There was no going back to filling out charts and taking temperatures. The bridge to that ordinary world had been burned to ashes. Months later, the city had settled into a new, tense equilibrium. The Kims were gone, a cautionary tale whispered in the underworld. Jean Huan's empire was stronger, more absolute than ever. Naomi stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse, looking down at the glittering, in different city. She was no longer wearing scrubs or a threadbare coat. She wore a simple, elegant dress of deep blue silk that felt like water against her skin. Jean Huan came to stand beside her, the scent of cedar and smoke a familiar comfort. A thin, silvery scar traced a line on his forearm, a permanent reminder of the night she had saved him. He didn't speak, just followed her gaze. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of everything they had survived. He never had to ask her to stay. Her presence was his answer. She reached out and placed her hand flat against the cold glass, feeling the faint vibration of the city below. She had been a girl freezing on a bench, waiting for a bus that never came. He had seen her. He had claimed her. But in the end, she was the one who had made the choice. She had walked into the cage and found not a prison, but a throne. And from this height, with this man by her side, the whole world looked like territory waiting to be conquered.